Deep in the mountains of northwestern Iran, a 5-member armed team was ambushed and wiped out by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in a firefight brutal enough that the aftermath photos are too graphic to show. That happened just days ago, and it's part of a pattern of internal violence that has been steadily accelerating inside Iran for more than a week now, almost entirely underneath the much larger headlines coming out of Tehran this week. At the same time, satellite imagery is showing Iran actively blockading the tunnel entrances to its own nuclear enrichment infrastructure, in a way that only makes sense if the regime believes a ground operation to seize its enriched uranium stockpile by force is a real possibility. And in the middle of all of it, a Navy helicopter went down in the Arabian Sea, and the search for the missing sailor aboard it has now come to an end without the outcome anyone was hoping for. Every claim in what follows is drawn from confirmed reporting, official statements from the U.S. Navy, published Kurdish human rights documentation, and on-record comments from Iranian officials themselves. None of it requires speculation to matter. Taken individually, each of these threads might read as a regional footnote. Taken together, over the exact same handful of days, they describe a regime and a region under a kind of simultaneous, compounding pressure that's easy to miss if you're only tracking one headline at a time. Let's walk through every piece of this, because taken together it paints a picture of a regime under more simultaneous pressure than almost any point since this war began back in February. And understanding each individual thread properly requires seeing exactly how they reinforce and compound one another, rather than treating any single headline in isolation. Start with the internal violence, because it's the part getting the least coverage relative to how significant it actually is, and because understanding it properly requires more than a single headline's worth of context. Iran's Revolutionary Guard announced that its forces killed members of a 5-person armed team in an ambush in the border heights near Piranshahr in Iran's northwestern Kurdish region, saying the team had crossed into Iranian territory a day earlier, and that bodies, weapons, and equipment were recovered from the site. Piranshahr sits inside West Azerbaijan province, one of the Kurdish majority regions along Iran's border with Iraq, where Kurdish opposition groups have operated on and off for decades. This specific ambush is part of a broader wave of clashes that has been building steadily over roughly the past 10 days, involving multiple Kurdish armed factions and Iranian security forces across at least 3 separate provinces. The casualty pattern here matters, and it's worth being precise about it rather than taking either side's numbers at face value. Independent Kurdish human rights monitors have published the names of Kurdish fighters killed in these clashes, while Iran's own state-aligned outlets have consistently reported different, generally lower figures for the same engagements. That gap between independently verified casualty lists and official Iranian state media claims has shown up in essentially every one of these incidents over the past 2 weeks. And it's a pattern serious observers of this conflict have learned to treat with real skepticism whenever Tehran puts out a number of its own. This isn't the first time in this conflict that Kurdish opposition groups have absorbed heavy losses in a single engagement, and the pattern of these ambushes deserves attention on its own terms, separate from the broader question of who is ultimately winning this particular fight. In several of the recent clashes, Kurdish fighters have reportedly been caught in what appear to be ambush positions rather than open engagements, suggesting either improved Iranian intelligence on Kurdish movement patterns or simply the accumulated advantage that comes from decades of the IRGC operating in this exact terrain against exactly this category of opponent. Whichever explanation turns out to be more accurate, the tactical reality on the ground right now favors neither side uniformly. Kurdish forces continue inflicting real, confirmed casualties on IRGC personnel across multiple provinces, even as individual Kurdish units occasionally walk into exactly the kind of ambush that produces the kind of graphic, one-sided casualty photos now circulating from the Piranshahr engagement. What makes this wave of violence significant isn't just the body count, it's the timing and the pattern. Kurdish opposition groups and other anti-government factions inside Iran were widely expected to rise up the moment this war began, back on February 28th. That didn't happen at anywhere near this scale in the early months of the conflict, for a range of reasons, including caution about being exposed to brutal retaliation and skepticism about whether outside powers would follow through on any support. What's happening now, months later, during a period when the broader shooting war between Iran, the United States, and Israel has nominally cooled into a ceasefire, is a meaningfully different phenomenon. It suggests that whatever held these internal opposition movements back during the war's most intense phase has weakened considerably, and that Iran's internal security situation is genuinely less stable right now than the regime wants either its own population or the outside world to believe. That delayed timing is itself worth examining closely, because it cuts against a simple narrative of foreign orchestrated uprising timed to the war's opening days. If this escalation were purely the product of external coordination between Kurdish groups and outside powers eager to exploit the initial chaos of February's strikes, the logical moment for a coordinated uprising would have been immediately, while Iran's command structure was at its most disoriented, and its conventional military was absorbing the heaviest damage of the entire war. Instead, the current wave of intensified clashes is unfolding months later during a comparative lull in the broader international conflict, which points towards something closer to an organically building internal dynamic. Growing Kurdish coordination, a cumulative sense that Iran's post-war weakness has become durable rather than temporary, and a widening opportunity created less by any single foreign hand and more by the accumulated strain of everything this regime has absorbed since February. There's also a practical, on-the-ground explanation worth considering alongside the political one. Strikes conducted earlier in the war against Iranian radar sites, command nodes, and air defense installations across exactly the same western border region, part of a campaign focused primarily on nuclear and leadership targets elsewhere in the country, appear to have left lasting gaps in Iran's ability to monitor and detect movement across this terrain in real time. Whether or not that degradation was ever explicitly intended to open a window for Kurdish operations, the practical effect looks very similar either way. A security apparatus with reduced visibility over exactly the terrain where its opponents operate most effectively, months after the strikes that cause that reduced visibility, rather than in the immediate aftermath, when Iranian forces might still have been actively working to patch the gap, a gap that appears, based on the pace of recent clashes, to still be open today. Now layer in the signals, suggesting Iran itself expects a ground operation targeting its nuclear material, because this is where the story shifts from internal unrest to something with far larger international stakes. Satellite imagery has shown Iran actively working to block and obstruct access to tunnel entrances at nuclear-related facilities, including sites within its broader enrichment infrastructure. There has been genuine public debate and disagreement among analysts and officials about exactly where Iran's remaining stockpile of highly enriched uranium currently sits, whether concentrated primarily at the Fordo facility, dispersed partially to Isfahan's nuclear technology center, or split across multiple locations following the strikes that damaged all three of Iran's principal nuclear sites earlier this year. That uncertainty is not a minor footnote. It is, according to the International Atomic Energy Agency's own public reporting, one of the central unresolved problems hanging over this entire conflict. The agency has stated plainly that it lost what it calls continuity of knowledge over Iran's nuclear material the moment inspectors were withdrawn following the war's opening strikes, meaning nobody outside Iran's own government can currently state with full confidence exactly how much enriched material remains, or precisely where it's being stored. It's worth being direct about why that uncertainty matters more than any single confident claim about a specific facility. Some commentary on this conflict has stated with total certainty that one particular site, rather than another, definitely holds Iran's remaining near-weapons-grade material. That kind of confident, singular claim should be treated with real caution, precisely because the IAEA itself, the one body with the technical expertise and historical access to actually know, has explicitly said it cannot currently verify that information with confidence. Anyone claiming perfect certainty about the exact location of Iran's enriched stockpile right now is offering an opinion dressed up as verified fact, and the honest answer, the one the world's own nuclear watchdog is giving, is that this is genuinely unknown from the outside. That gap between confident public claims and genuine institutional uncertainty deserves a moment of its own because it's a pattern that shows up constantly in coverage of this war. It's tempting, especially in a conflict this fast-moving and this heavily shrouded in secrecy on the Iranian side, to fill an information vacuum with the most specific, most authoritative-sounding claim available, regardless of whether that claim can actually be supported. The more honest and, frankly, more useful approach is to say plainly what is and isn't known. What's known? Strikes damaged all three of Iran's principal declared enrichment sites. What's known? The IAEA has had zero verified access to any of them since February. What's not known? And what nobody outside a small circle inside Tehran can currently confirm, the precise present-day location, quantity, and condition of Iran's remaining enriched uranium stockpile. Holding that distinction clearly is more useful to understanding this war than any single confident-sounding guess, however satisfying a definitive answer might feel. What can be said with real confidence is this: Iran is actively continuing to obstruct and block access to its nuclear sites, deliberately making the roads and tunnel approaches to these facilities more difficult to navigate rather than less. If Iran had any near-term intention of surrendering or transferring this material as part of a negotiated settlement, this kind of active ongoing fortification effort would make very little sense. Instead, it reads as a regime preparing for exactly the scenario it publicly denies expecting: a forced entry operation, whether by American Special Operations Forces, Israeli operatives, or some coordinated combination of both, aimed at physically locating and removing enriched material Iran has shown no willingness to hand over voluntarily. Blocking tunnel access and fortifying approach roads is precisely the kind of defensive preparation a government undertakes when it believes it needs to buy time, funnel any incoming force into predictable, defensible corridors, and allow its own security personnel time to converge on the area before an extraction operation could be completed. This lines up directly with a separate, deliberately blunt statement from Iran's own chief nuclear negotiator, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, who also serves as Speaker of Iran's parliament and stands among the 2 or 3 most powerful officials remaining in the country's current leadership structure, stated publicly that claims regarding inspector access to Iran's bombed nuclear sites are false. That's not diplomatic hedging. That's Iran's own most senior negotiator on the record, confirming that the international community will not be permitted to inspect the facilities that actually matter most to verifying whether Iran's nuclear weapons capability has genuinely been dismantled. Combine that statement with the active blockading of tunnel entrances captured in satellite imagery, and you get a consistent, coherent picture. Iran has no intention of allowing outside verification of its nuclear material, and is actively preparing its most sensitive sites to resist a forced entry rather than to welcome inspectors through the front door. Consider what it means that Iran's chief negotiator felt it necessary to make this statement publicly and directly, rather than simply allowing the ambiguity to persist quietly through the ongoing negotiations. A negotiator confident in his ability to eventually work out a face-saving compromise on inspection access typically has every incentive to let that ambiguity ride, to keep the door open rhetorically, even while stalling procedurally. Choosing instead to state flatly and publicly that reports of inspection access are false suggests either genuine confidence that this position carries no meaningful negotiating cost, or a calculated decision that domestic political messaging, reassuring hardline factions and the broader Iranian public that no capitulation on this specific point is coming, currently matters more than preserving flexibility at the negotiating table. Either way, it's a hard line drawn in public by the single most senior Iranian official actually sitting across the table from American and international negotiators. There's a separate thread involving Iranian drone strikes reaching well beyond Iran's own borders that deserves attention here too. A drone strike targeted the headquarters of an Iranian opposition group operating inside Erbil in northern Iraq, leaving visible fire damage at the site. Strikes like this one, hitting Iranian Kurdish opposition camps and facilities across the border inside Iraq's Kurdistan region, have become a near constant feature of this conflict, with independent monitors documenting well over 800 such strikes since the war's opening days in February. That campaign has continued essentially uninterrupted, regardless of the broader ceasefire, underscoring that whatever de-escalation has occurred between Iran, the United States, and Israel directly has done very little to calm the separate, ongoing conflict between Iran and the Kurdish opposition movements operating across its western border. Now bring the Strait of Hormuz back into this picture, because American military posture around that waterway tells its own story regardless of what diplomatic statements suggest. Despite the existence of a nominal ceasefire framework, American surveillance and combat aircraft have continued operating actively in the region, including airborne early warning aircraft, aerial refueling tankers supporting extended fighter patrols, and fighter jets themselves flying near the strait. That's not the posture of a military treating this ceasefire as fully secure. That's the posture of a force maintaining active readiness, because the underlying dispute over control of the strait remains genuinely unresolved. Iran, for its part, has continued declaring the security and stability of the strait to be what it calls a red line for its armed forces, language that leaves essentially no room for compromise on the question of who actually controls passage through that waterway once the current interim arrangement expires. That kind of sustained, visible American air presence, tankers, early warning aircraft, and fighters all operating together, represents a genuinely significant and expensive commitment of resources to maintain over an extended period. And it's not the kind of posture a military stands up casually or maintains indefinitely without real strategic purpose behind it. Every one of those aircraft in the air over or near the strait represents a deliberate signal to Iran and to every other government watching this exact dispute closely that the United States retains both the capability and the apparent willingness to respond immediately if Iran attempts to make good on its stated red line by actually interfering with shipping once the current 60-day window closes. Now bring in exactly what the American president has been saying about all of this, because his own public comments help frame how Washington is currently characterizing the state of negotiations. Asked directly about Iran's adherence to the Memorandum of Understanding both sides signed, he said he believed Iran had come a long way, referencing a round of strikes the American military carried out against Iranian targets, and stated that the core goal remained straightforward: denuclearization and ensuring Iran cannot possess a nuclear weapon. He pivoted from there into an extended riff on domestic economic investment, citing trillions of dollars in new manufacturing and infrastructure spending inside the United States, framing the broader success of his administration's economic agenda as connected to the resolution of exactly this kind of foreign conflict. Separately, when asked whether he was preparing to return to all-out war against Iran, he largely sidestepped the direct question, instead offering general comments, describing the denuclearization process as moving along well, describing recent talks as very good, and referencing an earlier 3-night bombing campaign against Iranian targets as evidence of the pressure already applied. Read those comments carefully because the pattern in them is consistent with how this administration has talked about Iran throughout the entire conflict. Confident, largely positive characterizations of how negotiations are proceeding, paired with a refusal to directly engage with pointed questions about renewed military action, and a persistent framing of past strikes as proof of American resolve rather than escalatory acts requiring explanation. That combination, optimism about the diplomatic track paired with deliberate ambiguity about the military one, appears to be a consistent, deliberate communication strategy rather than incidental phrasing. And it's worth noting that pattern precisely because it makes it difficult to take either the optimistic or the ambiguous half of these statements fully at face value on its own. There's a specific rhetorical move worth naming in how these comments were delivered, because it recurs constantly throughout this administration's public messaging on Iran. Economic success at home and pressure applied abroad get folded into the same breath, the same answer, the same sentence, as though domestic manufacturing investment and a foreign nuclear standoff are simply two facets of the same broader story of American strength. That framing serves an obvious political purpose, tying a complicated, unresolved foreign conflict to a much more straightforwardly positive narrative about domestic economic performance. But it also means that direct, specific questions about Iran policy, whether renewed strikes are being planned, whether inspectors will actually gain access, whether the Strait of Hormuz standoff will be resolved before its 60-day deadline, tend to get absorbed into broader, more comfortable talking points rather than answered with the same specificity the questions themselves demanded. Now, the helicopter. On July 1st, at roughly 3:30 in the morning Eastern Time, an MH-60S Seahawk helicopter assigned to the aircraft carrier USS George H.W. Bush conducted an emergency water landing in the Arabian Sea. 3 of the 4 crew members aboard were recovered and brought back to the carrier in stable condition. The Navy stated clearly that there was no indication the emergency was caused by hostile action, distinguishing this incident from a separate case weeks earlier in which an Army Apache helicopter was shot down by an Iranian drone over the Gulf of Oman, with both crew members in that earlier incident successfully rescued. The 4th crew member from the Seahawk, however, remained missing. What followed was an extensive, sustained search and rescue effort, ultimately running more than 100 hours and covering over 14,000 square miles of ocean, involving multiple aircraft carriers, guided missile destroyers, helicopter squadrons, anti-submarine aircraft, and United States Air Force assets working alongside the Navy. That search was formally suspended this past Sunday, meaning the mission has now concluded without the missing crew member having been located. The Navy has since identified him publicly as Commander Gabriel Edwards, the commanding officer of Helicopter Sea Combat Squadron 5, known as the Night Dippers, based out of Naval Air Station Norfolk. His strike group commander described him as a fearless leader whose legacy will not be forgotten. His family has spoken publicly about him as a devoted father and a respected mentor to those who served alongside him. It's worth pausing on that outcome directly because it's easy in a fast-moving news cycle full of geopolitical maneuvering and satellite imagery analysis to lose sight of the fact that real people with real families are the ones actually bearing the cost of this ongoing military posture in the Gulf. Whatever the eventual cause of that helicopter's emergency landing turns out to be, once the Navy's investigation concludes, a genuinely devastating outcome for one family is now part of the accumulated toll of maintaining this level of sustained military presence in a region still this volatile, months after the initial war officially transitioned into a ceasefire. That toll, according to figures provided to Congress earlier this year, already includes dozens of fixed-wing and rotary aircraft lost during the broader military campaign against Iran, a number that reflects just how intensive and sustained this entire operation has been, even during periods officially described as reduced hostilities. Commander Edwards' position as squadron commanding officer adds its own layer of weight to this loss. He wasn't simply an aircrew member assigned to a routine flight. He led the Night Dippers, one of the specific helicopter squadrons responsible for exactly the kind of search and rescue, logistics, and combat support missions that have kept this entire carrier strike group operational throughout months of sustained deployment in a genuinely contested theater. Losing a squadron commander in an operational mishap, rather than in direct combat, is its own particular kind of tragedy, one that underscores how much risk simply operating in this environment carries, even setting aside the question of hostile action entirely. The scale of the search effort mounted in response, over 100 hours, 14,000 square miles, multiple carrier strike groups and Air Force assets all contributing, reflects exactly how seriously the Navy treats the loss of one of its own, even amid everything else currently competing for military attention and resources across this same theater. That scale of response, committed even as the broader region absorbs a Kurdish insurgency, a nuclear standoff, and a maritime dispute all at once, says something important about institutional priorities that shouldn't be lost in the broader geopolitical analysis. Whatever else is happening across this theater, finding one missing sailor still commanded a genuinely massive, sustained allocation of military resources for well over 4 full days before that search was finally, reluctantly suspended. All of this is unfolding against the backdrop of a specific calendar that shouldn't be overlooked. Iran's multi-day state funeral for the supreme leader killed in the war's opening strike is scheduled to conclude with burial at the Imam Reza Shrine in Mashhad, and formal negotiations between Washington and Tehran over the underlying terms of a lasting peace remain paused specifically until those ceremonies finish. That means every one of the pressures described here, the Kurdish clashes, the fortified nuclear sites, the contested strait, the missing sailors' now concluded search, has been building during a period when Iran's own government has deliberately redirected national attention toward a ceremonial display of mourning and unity. Whether that timing was a deliberate choice to manage several simultaneous crises out of the public eye, or simply an unavoidable coincidence of a funeral calendar dictated by religious tradition rather than strategic planning, the practical effect is the same. A regime under this much compounding strain has, for the past several days, had the rest of the world's attention focused almost entirely elsewhere. That's precisely why threads like the Kurdish insurgency and the nuclear site fortification deserve more attention than they've been getting, not less. A funeral this size is, by design, meant to dominate a news cycle completely, but the pressures building underneath it, the ones with the potential to shape how this entire conflict actually resolves once formal negotiations resume, have continued accumulating in full regardless of where the cameras happen to be pointed this particular week. Internally, Iran is fighting an accelerating multi-province conflict against Kurdish and other opposition armed factions, one that appears to be intensifying rather than cooling even as the broader war with the United States and Israel has nominally quieted. Iran's own actions around its nuclear infrastructure, actively blockading tunnel access and fortifying approach roads, strongly suggest the regime genuinely believes some form of forced entry operation against its enriched material remains a real possibility, and its own chief negotiator has publicly confirmed inspectors will not be permitted access to the facilities that matter most. American military assets remain actively postured around the Strait of Hormuz despite the ceasefire, reflecting a continued lack of resolution over who actually controls that critical waterway once the current interim arrangement expires. And the accumulated human cost of maintaining this posture continues to grow, with a Navy officer now presumed lost in the waters off Iran's coast, his search formally concluded without recovery. None of these threads exist independently of each other. A regime fighting an internal insurgency along its western border, fortifying its nuclear sites against an anticipated forced entry operation, and locked in an unresolved standoff over a critical shipping waterway, is a regime spread genuinely thin across multiple simultaneous fronts. At the exact moment, its own supreme leader remains unseen in public, and its most senior military commanders have been forced to manage their own personal security with unusual caution. Whether that combination of pressures ultimately produces a genuine negotiated resolution, continued grinding stalemate along each of these individual fronts, or a renewed and more direct confrontation once the current funeral concludes and formal negotiations resume, remains one of the most consequential open questions in this entire conflict. And it is a question that will not wait for the world's attention to catch back up with everything that has actually been happening this week. There's a broader pattern worth naming as this specific week draws to a close, because it applies to almost every thread covered here. Regimes under this much simultaneous strain rarely announce their own vulnerability directly. They reveal it instead through exactly the kind of indirect signals this story has walked through. A chief negotiator forced to state a hard line publicly rather than letting ambiguity work in his favor. Satellite imagery showing defensive fortification rather than any preparation for handover. A military spokesperson insisting on readiness at the precise moment new opposition factions keep emerging inside the country's own cities. None of these signals, taken alone, proves definitively that this regime is on the verge of some larger collapse. Taken together, they describe a government managing an unusually wide and unusually simultaneous set of pressures, with no single front currently resolving cleanly in its favor, and with a growing list of quiet, individually modest developments that add up to something considerably larger than the sum of their parts. That's a pattern worth watching closely regardless of which individual thread eventually turns out to matter most. Sometimes it's the Kurdish insurgency that ends up defining the next chapter of this war. Sometimes it's the nuclear inspection standoff, or the Hormuz dispute, or some entirely new development that hasn't surfaced publicly yet. What the past week and a half has demonstrated clearly is that Iran is currently managing all of these pressures simultaneously, with none of the usual singular focus a government might otherwise bring to any one of them individually. And that reality alone is worth tracking closely as this conflict moves into its next phase, whichever specific front ends up mattering most in the weeks still ahead. Watch whether the pace of internal clashes between Iranian security forces and Kurdish opposition factions continues accelerating in the days ahead, because a genuine, sustained increase in this kind of internal violence would represent a meaningfully different phase of this war than anything seen during its earlier, more externally focused months. Watch whether satellite imagery continues to show active fortification work at Iran's nuclear sites, or whether that activity tapers off as negotiations resume, since a continued pattern of blockading and hardening would be difficult to reconcile with any genuine intention to accept outside verification. Watch whether American military posture around the Strait of Hormuz scales back once formal talks restart, or whether it remains at its current elevated tempo, since that posture is itself a signal about how much confidence Washington actually places in the current ceasefire holding. And watch how the investigation into the helicopter incident off Iran's coast concludes, because the answer to what actually caused that emergency landing, mechanical failure or something else entirely, will matter enormously for how this specific tragedy gets understood against the backdrop of everything else happening in this region right now. Consider finally what the accumulation of all these separate pressures actually says about the durability of the current ceasefire itself, because that's ultimately the question underneath every individual thread in this story. A ceasefire that has to coexist with an accelerating internal insurgency, active nuclear site fortification against an anticipated forced entry, a fully militarized standoff over a critical waterway, and the ongoing operational risk that just cost a Navy squadron commander his life is not a ceasefire in any conventional sense of the word. It's a pause in the most visible, most internationally reported category of hostilities, sitting on top of several other categories of conflict that never actually stopped. Understanding that distinction between a ceasefire as it's officially described and a ceasefire as it's actually being lived through on the ground in multiple provinces of western Iran, in the tunnels beneath Iran's nuclear sites, and in the waters off its southern coast, is the difference between believing this conflict is winding down and recognizing that it may simply be entering a quieter, more dispersed, and in some ways more dangerous phase, one where the headlines get smaller even as the number of active fronts keeps growing.